Good evening, everybody. It's my pleasure to introduce to you a woman whose accomplishments show how much we are truly capable of achieving, personally, academically, and professionally. Dr. Ellen Baker was born in North Carolina and grew up in New York. She and her husband are the parents of 2 daughters. She received her bachelor's degree in geology from the State University of New York at Buffalo and went on to earn her medical degree from Cornell University in 1978. She then completed her residency in internal medicine, and she has also earned a master's degree in public health in 1994 from the University of Texas School of Public Health. In 1981, Dr. Baker joined NASA, where she worked as a medical officer and a physician at the Johnson Space Center. In 1984, NASA selected her as an astronaut. During her career, Dr. Baker has been on 3 space flights. She has spent over 686 hours, or about a month, in space. She has orbited the Earth 453 times. And she has also worked very hard back here on planet Earth after completing her space missions. Dr. Baker continued to work at NASA until her retirement in December of 2011. Dr. Baker's life experiences and professional background exemplify what it means to have ambition to succeed, to realize one's potential, and to demonstrate leadership. As we all hear from Dr. Baker this evening, we can accomplish a lot when we reach for the stars, even if our career paths do not entail traveling into outer space. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ellen Baker.
Well, good evening, and it's really my pleasure to be here. Nice to meet the new scholars, the current scholars, and the past scholars, although I understand you're always scholars. It is kind of humbling sitting at the table here with such accomplished young men and women, and if I make any mistakes, make sure you correct me. This is one of my favorite photographs, and we'll get to it in a minute, but it's also the favorite photograph of one of the young men sitting at our table. Well, I thought I'd start out by taking a look at our world. Think about your world. Your view of the world changes as you grow up, but how big is it? What does it encompass? And how far have you ventured into the world? Where are your comfort zones? Maybe you haven't really thought about what defines your world. It wasn't something that was really that I thought about, certainly not in high school. And maybe you haven't thought about where your boundaries are or the borders are. And, realistically, maybe your view of the world is sort of Pennsylvania-centric or New York-centric or even United States-centric or even Earth-centric. But your world is bigger than you've ever imagined, really. And have you considered maybe there really aren't boundaries and there aren't borders? It wasn't something that I considered until a little later in my life. So I thought I'd start with this picture of our world. It's very, very far away, a sea of distant galaxies, a very little speck in the sky. And if you kind of hold your arm out here and you look at where your fingernail is, that's sort of the little speck of the sky, maybe even smaller, that the Hubble Space Telescope photographed here. And in this little speck of the sky, and I actually did not know that the Hubble pointed at this dark spot in the sky for all those days, but I was educated on that at the table. But there are 5,000 galaxies in here. Each of those little points of light is not a star, it's a galaxy. It's a phenomenal picture. Maybe there's 250 trillion stars in this little spot of the sky, and it's a number that's so big I just can't even get my head around it. But I just show it to I guess exemplify and to remind people that the universe is just gigantic, and there's just no really comprehending how big it is. But if we take another leap, maybe inward, suppose we were looking at our galaxy, it might look something like this. Again, lots of stars in here, and in fact, when you look up at the sky at night, you're seeing stars in our galaxy. But maybe one little ordinary star in the Milky Way is surrounded by, used to be 9, I guess now it's 8 planets, one of which is really quite special and quite unique. And in fact, this photograph was taken by the Galileo spacecraft, which I was fortunate to have deployed, and it subsequently arrived at Jupiter about 6 years after we released it, and spent a couple of years orbiting Jupiter, but it got this beautiful, beautiful view of the Earth and the Moon as it left our vicinity. Well, our planet is our world, and that's what most people think of when they think our world. It's truly a beautiful blue marble floating in a sea of black. But maybe people think of their world a little bit closer to home. So maybe you think of this. You got Cape Cod and Long Island, Pennsylvania in there somewhere. Maybe the East Coast, that's kind of familiar territory. Or maybe you haven't ventured that far, and maybe your world is here. This is Pennsylvania, almost the whole thing, with Lake Erie and the Chesapeake Bay and Washington and Baltimore down here, and the beautiful mountains running through the state. Or maybe it's the valley of the Susquehanna, and maybe it's Lancaster. I think that's Lancaster. Well, this was my view of the world. I grew up in New York City, and you can see we got the Hudson River here, and way out there is like Las Vegas and California, and I knew China was out there somewhere too. But I had barely gone west of Manhattan until I left for medical school. Honestly, I did go to college in Buffalo, but I had no idea what was out there, and I actually love this picture, but this was my view of the world. And we can all probably draw a similar map if you think about it. So even if you've never physically traveled far from your home, there's really nothing to stop you from learning about distant places and imagining other worlds. And maybe for many of us, those of you who are the new scholars, just thinking about going to college, those of you who are graduating from college, maybe thinking about looking for your first job, maybe that'll be the first time that you look beyond your comfort zone and you look at other worlds that you're sort of unfamiliar with. Well, I don't generally like talking about myself, but Roger did ask me to tell a story about sort of how it came to be. And it's a little bit of luck and a little bit of accidental turns here and there, but I thought as I went through a little bit of this narrative, I'd talk about some of the things I learned along the way, and many of you will know these things, but I'll maybe put them in the context of sort of what I've done and where I've been. So here goes. Don't let barriers, be they real or imagined, keep you from succeeding and doing what you want to do and following your passions. So New York is a big place, and my schools had numbers and not names. I went to elementary school at number 41 and junior high school at 158, and I was one of 1,300 students in my high school graduating class. But I actually didn't feel that lost. I mean, it's a big place and lots of kids, but I felt kind of at home. And my greatest ambition from the time I could walk until maybe now was to play baseball for the New York Yankees. And as much as it was really obvious, it never really occurred to me that there were only boys out there on the field. And in preparation for my time in the majors, I used to go hang out at the local park for Little League practices and Little League games, and I would wait for the day when only 8 boys showed up and I got to take the field. It would happen maybe once a year, and as you can imagine, I was a real embarrassment to my older brother. Well, that was a barrier that I have not been able to break, I'm very disappointed to say, and maybe one day, I would say my daughters, they're not interested in baseball, but maybe one day that barrier will be broken and some little girl will get to play for the New York Yankees. You're probably all Phillies fans here, right? So you don't understand the whole Yankees thing, but Roger, you understand the Yankees thing. Okay, well, that brings me sort of to my next thing. Don't let others tell you that you can't do something. keep a positive outlook, move forward, try not to look back too often. So one of my colleagues, Shannon Lucid, who until a few years ago held the time and space record for American astronauts, spent 6 months on the Mir space station, and she was told by her 8th grade science teacher in Oklahoma that she could not be a scientist, nor could she be an astronaut. That was not something girls did. Well, fortunately, Shannon didn't listen to her. Shannon doesn't listen to many people, but that was a good thing. And she pursued a very successful career as a researcher in biochemistry and then became a very accomplished astronaut. This probably seems like ancient history to people, but when I was in school, there were actually shockingly few opportunities for girls, and what happened to Shannon was not all that unusual. At recess, the girls were expected to sew while the boys got to go outside and play baseball, and you know how I feel about baseball. But you don't know how I feel about sewing, and I would rather have died than sew when I was 10 years old. And I am proud to say that I was instrumental in getting this grave injustice turned around. Girls took home ec and were not permitted to take woodshop. And I am still kind of unhappy about this. And at this point in my life, I realized actually sewing would be a good skill to have, and it's kind of a shame that I can't sew, but I don't know how to do woodworking either, and maybe that will be something that I will try to learn in the upcoming years. I thought about going to the math magnet school in New York City. It's a public school. Girls were not permitted to go to the math school. I mean, go figure, I guess they're not supposed to be good at math. And when my interest drifted from baseball, I thought, well, maybe I will go to one of the military academies. I'd love to fly airplanes. But girls did not get to go to the military academies either. Does this sound like boring old history to you guys? It's shocking to think about, and my kids can't believe it, but that's the way it was. And being barred from the military academies actually didn't stop my astronaut colleague, Marcia Ivins, who's here with the scarf, from flying airplanes. She grew up in Philadelphia. Flying was her passion. She had her pilot's license before she had her driver's license. She has several thousand hours of flight time flying single-engine, Cessnas, twins, biplanes, seaplanes, gliders, jets, and rockets. If it flies, Marcia has flown it. That was a barrier. Marcia never looked at it. Anyway, you would think I would be discouraged and kind of maybe change my expectations a little when I realized there were all these things I wasn't allowed to do. But somehow I wasn't discouraged, and somehow I never really lowered my expectations. Though there were fewer doors open to me and maybe fewer opportunities, it still just never really occurred to me that I wouldn't be able to do with my life whatever it was I decided. And I kind of took this all in stride. It was sort of the way it was, and I forged ahead, and I was confident that things would work out if I worked hard enough and I did well, even though I wasn't actually really sure what those things were yet. Okay, so the next one, you don't have to be perfect. You don't have to be a genius to do difficult and challenging things. It's important to be smart, and that helps, but just as important, and maybe more important, is hard work and perseverance. So I was not number one in my high school class. I didn't have great SAT scores. When I say I was normal, I actually really mean it. But what I was really motivated, and I believed in myself, I guess you could say. I knew that my future was in my hands, and I could achieve my goals, whatever they turned out to be. And they changed fairly frequently, which I know is the case for many of you who went to college thinking you'd go into medicine and then went into something completely different. I went to school in Buffalo. I chose to study science and math. I'm embarrassed to say part of the reason was I really didn't like writing papers, but I also loved science and math. I loved knowing why things worked and how they worked. everything from rocks, I majored in geology, to oceans, amoebas, the human brain. I wasn't really sure what I was going to do with it all, and honestly, I knew a little bit about medicine because my father was a doctor, but I was remarkably ignorant of the nuts and bolts of various career choices. I'm embarrassed to tell you I had no idea what an engineer did. I thought they drove trains. You probably don't believe me, but that's what I thought. It's a bit frightening when I think about how ignorant I was at age 17. And I wish I could tell you a really nice, neat story that I always wanted to be an astronaut. I set my sights on the goal. I worked for years to achieve it. I kind of organized everything and arranged it. And I was finally successful, but as you know, life stories and journeys are often messy and a bit chaotic, and they're rarely very neat. But I will tell you this, never in a million years did I think that I could be an astronaut or I would be an astronaut. It never crossed my mind. So I said perseverance. Some of our very accomplished and best astronauts, if you want to classify them that way, didn't get selected the first time they applied. In fact, some of them applied maybe 4 times, maybe 5 times over a period of 10 or 15 years before they were ultimately selected. They hung in there, they enjoyed what they were doing, they kept doing what they were doing, and they kept hoping that this door would open to them. They had a lot of perseverance. It takes a lot of strength to continue at something like that, and they did. So look for opportunities, take advantage of them, be bold, maybe take that path that's less traveled. Learn from others, be open to new ideas. College was a great place for me to explore and learn all those things I seemed to have missed in high school. It was a great place to meet new people with a great diversity of interests and ideas. It was an eye-opening and mind-opening experience. People from different circumstances and different places. And of course, you get a lot more out of college than just what you learn in the classroom. And it's largely a reflection of how much you put into it. I knew it was my responsibility to work hard and do well, but also to take advantage of everything that there was to offer. The faculty, the clubs, the invited speakers, the events. I mean, there's just so much going on. And it was my responsibility to do that. Well, not surprisingly, I ended up studying medicine. By that time, my brother was in medical school, and it seemed like the right thing to do. And while I looked in a few other directions, I decided medicine would be good for me. It would allow me to do something new every day and something different every day. It would be challenging. And I liked things that were challenging, and I liked things that were hard. And I knew it would be also rewarding. But sometimes life occasionally throws you a curveball, and I never anticipated this one. So think big, and sometimes the impossible is not. So this is another one of my colleagues. He's from Costa Rica. His name is Franklin Chang Diaz. He always wanted to be an astronaut, and when he was a little boy in Costa Rica, he used to go to the U.S. Embassy when there were space missions, and they would have the audio on the radio, and you could hear the astronauts talking to mission control when they'd say, well, we need you to throw this switch, and the astronaut would say, okay, Roger. Well, Franklin always wondered, who is Roger? But he was determined, and he came to the U.S. as a high school student without his family. He lived with family friends, went to high school in Connecticut, went to University of Connecticut, ended up at MIT with a PhD in astrophysics. He was selected as an astronaut and flew 7 missions on the space shuttle. So, think big, and sometimes the impossible is really possible. For me, it was a little article in the days of newspapers in the New York Times when I was in medical school that said, NASA's selecting new astronauts, women and minorities urged to apply. I wasn't quite ready to apply. It still seemed like an unreachable fairy tale, but it planted a little seed. And here I am. Did I have any idea of what was involved in the business of being an astronaut? Honestly, not really. I knew a little bit. I loved the lore of aviation. I loved imagining the challenges that I would face. And I really was interested and enthusiastic to play a small part in history and be part of something that was a whole lot bigger than me. Something that I thought was a great adventure and a grand endeavor and was really critical to the strength and the position of our country in the world. And here's one more. Sometimes you just get lucky, so enjoy it. And that's how you get selected. There are a lot of people out there with really good records and who are really talented and really smart, and there's always an element of luck in getting a position like this. I was in the right place at the right time, and I was very lucky. And I'm very grateful for that as well. Well, in the middle of all this, because I'm kind of tired of talking about myself, I thought I'd just show you some nice space pictures, because that's usually what I do when I go do astronaut sort of talks. So the astronaut, well, the America's space program is a little more than 50 years old, half a century, and it was born into the Cold War. And it was a real race and a real duel between the United States and the Soviet Union. And for most of those 50 years, this is where we launched American astronauts into space. Florida, Cape Canaveral right here, Kennedy Space Center. And by the way, this is what it looks like out the window. Those early flights, the Mercury flights, were to prove that we could send somebody up, they'd do okay, they'd be able to function, and we could bring them back to Earth and they would still be alive. But about this time, President Kennedy challenged us to send a man to the moon and return him safely to Earth. And he said, we do this not because it is easy, but because it is hard. And that threw down the gauntlet, and the Soviets and the Americans were off and running in trying to get us to the moon. And of course, we know who got there first, but it was not that the Soviets were not trying. It was a really exciting time. And actually, the US space program in the 1960s, in the midst of the Cold War, in the midst of the Vietnam War, it was something Americans were proud of. And no question that going to the moon was an incredible feat of technical excellence. And I'm sorry to say, something that we no longer can do for a number of reasons. Well, after the Apollo program, and by the way, we sent 6 vehicles down to the lunar surface, and we had 12 American astronauts walk on the moon. There was a hiatus for a number of years until the shuttle program came into being, and I imagine most of you guys are fairly familiar with this, but it was a totally new kind of vehicle. It was reusable. It could lift heavy payloads into orbit. We could take things up. We could bring things down, and we had a big crew. For the early part of the shuttle program, we used it as an orbiting laboratory. We used it to repair satellites in orbit, to launch satellites, study the heavens, study the Earth. And for the last 10 years or so of the program, we took cargo and parts of the space station up to orbit. We took crews up and back. And you can see the space station is just enormous. Have any of you guys ever seen it go overhead at night? You have, I know you have. You can see it really clearly. It looks like a very bright star if you know exactly when it's going to be passing overhead. And it's pretty cool to look up there and see it pass overhead and think, gee, there's people in that. But anyway, the shuttle would dock with the station. We'd bring up the various modules that are part of station. We bring up the solar arrays, crew exchange, those sorts of things. And we did this until the shuttle was retired in 2011, and this is the way we get astronauts to space station now. This is a Russian rocket, the Soyuz rocket, and for the foreseeable future, unfortunately, this is the only way we're going to be able to get astronauts into space. Like I said, it's a huge module. It's a huge station. It's an international program. It's got a Russian module, an American module, a bunch of parts that hold them all together. It's got a European laboratory and a Japanese laboratory. And at any one time, the crew up there, currently a crew of 6, might include a Russian and American always, and then one of our international partners. So you get into space in 8.5 minutes. You go from 0 to 17,500 miles an hour in 8.5 minutes, and bingo, you're in orbit. And as soon as those engines turn off, you're weightless. Now, I'm going to say you're weightless. There's a little bit of G because you're in orbit, so maybe 10 to the minus 3G or 10 to the minus 4G. Anything that's not Velcroed down or fastened down will float, including your hair. And just suffice it to say that every day in space is a bad hair day. Again, an international crew. When we were flying the shuttle, we would frequently have a crew of 6. There might be 6 on the space station, so sometimes we had 12 people up there at one time, which is really kind of cool. It was a far cry from the capsules of the past, where maybe we had 2 or 3 crew members. Well, lots of barriers have been broken. There's many women in the space program now. There's people from all walks of life and people of really from all around the world, in fact. And this is kind of a historic picture. Pam Melroy was the shuttle commander. Peggy Whitson was the commander of the space station. So there you go. It kind of went without notice, and I guess that's good. We had 2 space commanders shaking hands after the docking of the shuttle to the space station, and they were both women. So again, what did we do with the space shuttle? We launched satellites, the Hubble telescope. We used it as a laboratory, and of course this is very much what we do now on space station. I was asked at dinner if I was a scientist on board, and actually I was an astronaut on board. The scientists are really all on the ground. Once you get into the astronaut program, you become an operator of science experiments more than a designer of science experiments, and so you have dozens of different things that you have to do when you're in space. Some of them are operating the experiments, and so you really don't have the luxury and the time to be a laboratory scientist like you might expect at an academic center or something like that. But we're good at operating the experiments. We work closely with the scientists on the ground. Sometimes things don't work and we have to know how to fix them and those sorts of things. Occasionally we have to leave the comfort and the safety of the vehicle, be it the shuttle or the space station, put on that 250-pound spacesuit, which fortunately weighs very little in space, and go out and assemble the space station or fix something that's broken. And by the way, the way we train to do that is in a swimming pool where you're neutrally buoyant and you can practice using the suit and doing what you need to do, using the tools underwater where you don't feel the weight and the heaviness of the suit. It's really easy to live in space. You know, it's kind of interesting when you think about it. Here we have evolved and we've grown up all under the influence of gravity. 8.5 minutes, bingo, you're in space. And you'd be amazed at how fast you get used to doing things, and it's actually really fun. There's a little bit of an adjustment period going up where some people don't feel that well. We call it space motion sickness, sort of like seasickness, but you get over it. And then a little adjustment period when you get back, but really once you're there, it's a piece of cake. I mean, it's really quite easy. This is how you make a taco in space, and you probably don't want to do this at home. Lots of opportunities to play with your food. Bite-sized foods are good. And the other thing we do when we're not working is we exercise. I mean, you can be a real strong man, lift heavy weights, hold your buddy up with one finger. But in all seriousness, if we ever think about a trip to Mars, we're going to have people out in space for a long period of time. And when your body is no longer working under gravity, your muscles become weak, your bones become weak. There's a number of physiologic changes that take place. And so we require all of our astronauts on board the space station for prolonged periods of time to exercise. It keeps their muscles healthy, their bones strong, so that when they return to Earth, they're functional and they're not at risk of getting injured. If you were going to live in space forever, it wouldn't probably be necessary. So how would it be to live with your best buddies in a small, confined area for 6 months? Think about it. not only do crews have to train for the technical aspects, we do have to train them to get along, because 6 months is a long time to be with even your best friends, even people from your own cultures, people that you're familiar with. And we do actually provide that sort of training. But you also have to give people downtime. You know, the shuttle was kind of a sprint. Flights were 10 days or 2 weeks, and every minute was scheduled. Space station is not quite that sprint. It's more like a marathon. You got to give people downtime. Maybe they like to read. Maybe they can bring their guitar or their flute or their keyboard or whatever they need to do to relax. And they're able to use the computer and patch through phone calls now to their family, which is sometimes good and keeping in touch, not always good. You don't want your crew on board space station to be worried that the toilet is stopped up in their house, you know, so you want to try and balance the keeping in touch and not worrying about stuff that you can't control. And we try to ensure that everybody gets adequate rest, and so everybody's scheduled for an 8-hour sleep period. Your body kind of assumes this neutral position like you might if you were floating in water. I like the feel of a pillow on my head, but you have to strap your head to it, otherwise it'll float off. Okay, and the bathroom, it uses a lot of suction, and I will just leave it at that. Okay, one of the real privileges and one of the magnificent things about flying in space is looking out the window. And when I talked about our world, we all think of planet Earth. 17,500 miles an hour, we make an orbit once every 90 minutes. I could have gone around the world a whole bunch of times today in the time it took me to get here from Houston. But you think about it, you're only 220 miles up, you get a great view of what's on the Earth. The stars are no closer, the moon is not really any closer. You don't have the atmosphere to look through and weather, so the sky is really clear, but you get to see all sorts of beautiful things on the ground. Might be a volcano, maybe a hurricane, maybe even Philadelphia. So you think about making those orbits once every 90 minutes, that means, you know, half the world is in darkness, half is in light, so you're passing from dark to light and light to dark 16 times a day. So you have 16 sunrises and 16 sunsets a day, and you pretty much never know what time it is. It's very confusing, but it's actually beautiful. I lived in New York City, never once saw the aurora, but you can see it beautifully, beautifully from space. And even in those dark passes, you can see where people live. This is the Nile and the Mediterranean and the delta of the Nile, and you can see people live along the coasts, and here Israel is quite bright, but just fabulous even in darkness. Well, flying in space is technical, complex, complicated. What does it take to make a successful program? Of course, you know, the design, the development, the construction, the operation of any space vehicle is going to require a lot of technical skill, technical excellence, expertise, and the hard work of a lot of people. And of course, astronauts get to enjoy the fruits of everybody's labor, but space exploration and space travel also require a lot of the personal and interpersonal skills that are needed for success in other fields as well. No matter what you're doing, don't lose sight of the big picture. Know where you're going, but be flexible, because you might have to sort of change directions to get there. Be willing to change the course if it's required. Don't miss any of the details. So you got to see the forest and you got to see all the trees. Be strong in your principles and your personal and professional integrity, and always do what's right. Compromise when it's appropriate, but don't sacrifice your values. There are lines in the sand that you shouldn't cross. If you're not happy with how things are going, figure out what you need to do to make it better. Be part of the solution. I always tell my kids they're not allowed to complain unless they're working to figure out how to fix whatever it is they're complaining about. Leadership is certainly important, and I know that's stressed here, but so is teamwork. And be a strong leader, be a good team member. You can be both. Not everybody can be a leader all the time, but everybody can be a team member all the time. Know how to fit in so that your input is valuable. Always demand excellence of yourself. Be proud of what you do, but be forgiving and understanding of yourself and others. It's a fine line. Be firm and be kind. Who do you want to be? How do you see yourself? Remember that you're in control. You can't always control what's going on around you, but you can always control your response, your reaction, and your role in the world. And then, whoops. This is Leland Melvin over here. Leland, his parents were school teachers. He's from Virginia. He was drafted to play in the NFL, I think for Detroit. And then he got injured, so he had to become an astronaut instead. A great disappointment. Leland says, and I agree, play hard and always share the ball. So once again, taking a look at the world from the inside out, you know, maybe we're comfortable on our home turf, but, you know, the sky is not the limit, and maybe we should look well beyond the sky. It's a really exciting time in your life, and I envy you, and I'd be excited to hear about the journeys that you're going to take. And of course, many of you will end up doing things you never imagined. I certainly did. And I'll sort of end with a quote that is attributed to Jim Lovell, the commander of Apollo 13, but I don't actually know if he really said it, but I like it, so I'm going to say it. There are people who make things happen. There are people who watch things happen, and then there are people who wonder what happened. Be the person who makes things happen. Thank you.